last time you were on, we talked a lot about the book of Acts.
Yeah.
We talked about the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And we're in this kind of mini series
Yeah.
about the Holy Spirit.
Come
right?
on. I love it. Let's
and
go.
so you've talked about Spirit several times
Yeah.
in talking about all the different things you're doing, right? But I think we'd love to start with, like, what has your experience been with the Holy Spirit, even from like a child?
Yeah.
Like, did you, like, we know you grew up in the church, but was Holy Spirit there? Like, what was your experience since you were a kid?
4th grade, I'm in a Christian school, and the principal of the school leads chapel for elementary kids, right? I'm in 4th grade. He gets up there and he says, you can be filled with the Holy Spirit. And when you're filled with the Holy Spirit, supernatural things start to happen. And one of those things is you start to speak in tongues. Who wants to be filled with the Holy Spirit and speak in tongues? And I'm in 4th grade, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. You know, like, and I think that that's significant because I think that I didn't have enough. I didn't have enough maturity to talk myself out of believing. And childlike faith, right? You can't inherit the kingdom unless you have childlike faith, right? I think I wish I could go back to that moment many times over, because I think I believe God a lot more as an 8 or 9-year-old than I do as like a 40-something. But he says, who wants it? And I'm like, well, I want it. And my 4th grade teacher just kind of put her hand on my shoulder. And this was all the kids, though. You know, I mean, it wasn't just me. And I started speaking in tongues. And I have always since.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I grew up in an environment where there's a lot of things about the church that I grew up in that at the time I would not want to replicate. I think theologically, a lot of legalism and a lot of, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, then God's going to be angry with you. And, you know, like like God's never happy with you. You know, like lots of things that I think are not great and not accurate. But they did believe 100% that when we worshiped, that the presence of God was there, and they taught that, and they believed absolutely in the power of the Holy Spirit. And so I grew up kind of in that environment, but the truth is that from that point on, for the rest of my life, any time that the church was at worship, I could sense the presence of God, and I was aware of the presence of God, and I could feel it pulling me. And I always knew that. And so I never like went to church and just watched, because there was always something in me that knew that he was there.
Can you explain what that feels like?
Well, he is there. And I think that Jesus said that every time we gather, he'd be there. And then he said that you can be filled with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit's there with you and in you, right? And among you. And so like we have that promise. And you see a pattern for that in the Old Testament, where people would go into the presence of God and they would be marked by it. Like it would change them because they were face to face with God. And then essentially the gate is swung open wide when Jesus dies on the cross. Now anyone can access that anytime they want to. But I think a lot of us haven't ever learned that that's there for us and that's available, or what that is. And what it literally is that the very thing that makes heaven is present here in this realm on the earth. And I think that I have been in environments where I have really sensed the presence of God, and it is pure love and pure peace and holy and overwhelming. And sometimes it's pure joy, you know, and I have sensed that, and the person next to me didn't recognize it. I've seen that dynamic, and I think that sometimes it's because they didn't know. They didn't understand. They were never given a context for that. But that's rare to me. Normally, even someone who's an unbeliever who doesn't know anything about God can sense that there's something happening in the room. Even if they're just observing it in other people, but you can sense it, you know? Last night at church, there was a guy who I don't think I've ever seen him before. And I was on the stage mid-sermon preaching, and I just felt the Holy Spirit say, you need to prophesy to that kid. I thought, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to him, but the Holy Spirit just pointed him out to me. And I'm like, okay, but I wasn't going to stop right then and there and do it because I was in the middle of preaching. And so we get to the end of the sermon, the worship team, is back up, and we invite people to come down for prayer. And he gets out of his seat and comes down for prayer. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go do it. And so I go over to him, and I'm like, he's coming for prayer, so I'm like, I'm just gonna pray over you. And as soon as I pray for him, there are all of these things that just come to mind. Like, here's what you need to say to him. And I don't know this kid at all, but there's all of these things that I felt like the Holy Spirit was saying about what God was going to do in this next season and what God had done in the last season. And as I say this, he just breaks down crying. I mean, just like sobbing under whatever it is that God was doing. And, there's this part of me that's like, there's a risk that this could all be wrong, right? But it's what I feel the Holy Spirit saying. But man, this kid had an encounter with God, and he sobbed, I want to say, for 45 minutes on his knees, worshiping like God was doing something in his heart. And I have no idea what he needed to hear, but whatever was said to him did something to him. And so when something like that happens in a room, it's obvious to know, like, to people watching, something's happening to that kid.
Yeah.
Right. Something like you can see the physical reaction, or in charismatic circles, sometimes we use the word, the physical manifestation. Like there's something happening to you that I can observe. And so I think that when God's up to something, it even if you don't believe, even if you've never had experience with God, many times you can perceive it.